Hi, it's Pete here from See Your Toes again. This is part 2 of a 3-part series talking to Valerie, an anorexic who has survived against all odds. If you haven't listened to part 1, I strongly suggest you turn this off, go and find part 1 and listen to that first. I hope you enjoy listening to her story, and I hope it inspires you to take action on any chronic illnesses you have. If Valerie can survive, I think anybody can survive the chronic illnesses. Thank you.
The other devastating surgery that I had at that time was in 2010. I was 40 and I had had several surgeries that were directly caused by my starvation, my severe sarcopenia. This particular surgery was extremely devastating. At this point, I had spent almost 30 years at 75 pounds. That's a BMI of 11. And
for people in the metric community, that's 34 kilograms, which is tiny.
Yes, especially for my height.
Yeah.
So at that point, I not only had lost all external skeletal muscle, my body was eating away at internal musculature, and I had none left internally. I could not hold organs in place. I began to have extreme pelvic pain 2009 into 2010, and it took a series of several specialists to diagnose that I was experiencing multiple organ prolapse. I could not hold organs in place any longer. And what should have been, an immediate urgent surgery had to wait until these surgical specialists could coordinate their time to piggyback off of each other while I was opened up in the operating room. They used a horizontal incision, and each specialist came in and did their part to patch me up the best they could, and then they would leave and the next one would come in and do their part. The organs that prolapsed not only prolapsed internally, but when I stood up, they prolapsed externally also. So it was a very difficult wait for the 8 weeks to go by in order to then go into the hospital and have the surgery. And the organs that prolapsed were my colon, my uterus, and my bladder. My colon, in order to repair that, they had to remove 18 inches of my colon and then reattach it. And since there was nothing to reattach it to, they sutured it to my tailbone internally. They call that a rectopexy. The reason the 18 inches had to be removed was from the decades of laxative abuse. I was swallowing whole bottles of stimulant, harsh laxatives, and it damaged my colon so severely that they had to, remove that much. My uterus could not be saved. It needed to be removed. And my bladder was put back in position with a lot of surgical mesh internally. They constructed a sling that would internally hold it where it needed to be. The recovery for that was supposed to be a few months, and it took over a year before I felt that I wasn't in constant pain pelvically. And because I couldn't exercise, I couldn't give in to the drive to exercise. My anorexia and starvation and cutting and hair pulling got worse. So this whole time that I'm recovering, I'm consuming plain chicken broth, anything that was the lowest amount of calories with the highest volume to warm me up, cups full of cooked spinach, cups full of hot cooked celery, anything that was the lowest amount of calories, because I wasn't well. Yeah, I knew about 2015. I knew that this was crazy. That I wasn't going to make it another year. I wasn't going to survive another year. And what I had done for 35 years was never going to work. I had done everything. I had gone everywhere. I had seen every doctor, every specialist, every treatment that was all the same, every medication. And the last psychiatrist that I saw just looked me in the eye and said, "You just got to accept this. There's nothing more that we can do. You have to accept that this is your life and just try to survive." And that's all it is. You're not living. You're not thriving. You have no vibrancy. You are white knuckling it through every single day, praying to not wake up. But you also know that if that prayer comes true, that your family that's already suffered and watched this and experienced this for decades would be even further harmed if I didn't wake up. The grief that they would have to endure was unimaginable to me. I knew something had to be wrong in my brain. Something, it wasn't putting on 10 or 15 pounds. It wasn't meds. It wasn't talk therapy. It wasn't behavioral therapy. None of that made a difference. But I knew that there had to be something wrong with my brain. I found a couple books at the library by an author named Julia Ross, and they were called The Mood Cure and The Diet Cure. This was the first time that I had ever read in print someone talking about what the brain actually needs for optimal health, for cognitively to be correct, for those neurons to fire correctly, to have good thoughts, to have a calm brain. And what she was talking about, the amino acids that are the building blocks that make the more than 100 neurotransmitters that are in our brain, if those are not there, if those building blocks are not there, your brain suffers tremendously. And that's where the mental illnesses stem from. There is a root cause, there is a neurological cause, and there is a way to reverse it. This was a small light bulb moment in my brain, because for her, she was not advocating for getting your amino acids from plants. Her whole premise in both of those books was using whole animal products for healing. My light bulb moment at this was the acknowledgement that I had not eaten any meat or fat for 35 years. And even though I felt that I had tried everything to get better, I had not tried that. So I couldn't imagine that it could help me. I was very skeptical that this could be my answer. How could food, how could meat make any impact in my brain or my mental health? I had not heard this before. The only time in school or nutrition classes in college that we ever talked about protein was just for bodybuilders, just for muscle development. There was no connection to what it does for the brain. So armed with the knowledge that I had gleaned from those two books, I began searching online at that point. At that time, in 2015, 16, 17, on YouTube, the famous talks were called TED Talks. And I started searching, can I find more information to to back up what these two books were telling me. And that's when I found Dr. Georgia Ede and Dr. Chris Palmer. Their research, their TED Talks, their online presence, and then after that, what I found online on printed research papers that they'd done, documents that they had written, were completely 100% in conjunction with these two books that I had read. They were constantly talking about what the brain needs, that the brain is 60% fat and 20% of that is cholesterol. And it is needed, it is required for good cognitive function. And the most absorbable source that will be the building blocks to reverse any cognitive issues is using animal products. I was sharing this with my husband. He, of course, was desperate for me to be better. At this point, there were times when he would come to me with tears in his eyes because he was down the road thinking that I also was not going to survive, that he was going to wake up one day and I would have passed in my sleep or had cardiac arrest. And he knew my torment. He is my best friend, my companion, my love, my soulmate. And we talked about this every day. He knows everything that we're talking about. He knows all the nitty-gritty, ugly details of all of this and felt, of course, helpless to help me. And he also knew that traditional treatment was not going to help me. We had beat that dead horse dead. That there was nothing left. And he all along had been encouraging me to eat meat because he's a meat and potatoes man, and that's how I cooked. I'm the cook of the household. But I was resistant because I had not ever heard that it could help me. I just continued to listen to the anorexia part of me that would either say I didn't deserve to eat or that that was not going to help me, that all of the nutritionists told me that that was not necessary, that I was just sick and I was never going to get better. So January 1, 2018, I set myself on a course. I knew that relapse for me was very real. I could do better for weeks at a time, forcing myself to eat oatmeal and a baked potato. And if I felt that I ate one bite too much, the next 48 hours, I would not eat anything. So I knew that I had to do this slow. I was not the normal person who could trade one plate of food for another plate of food. This was uncharted territory. I couldn't even trade 2 cups full of cooked spinach for 2 cups of meat. This had to be a strategic, well-planned, ketogenic, metabolic way for me that was going to be sustainable to see if it could help me. I wasn't even a person, because of the anorexia, I couldn't even swallow a spoonful of tallow, a spoonful of MCT oil. I had been averse to any fat for decades. So, I couldn't even try to get into ketosis by utilizing, tablespoons of fat. So I did the only thing that I thought that would work. I thought about the most mild meat that I could think of. And for me, that was fat-free chicken. So that's where I started. And I promised myself that I would eat a certain amount for a week, hoping that in a week, the daily amount, I would get used to it. And then I would be able to double it. That was my goal. And that's what I did. For a week, that first week in January of 2018, I ate 1 ounce of chicken every day, 2 tablespoons, but that's all I could do. I sat at the kitchen table and just cried and wept because Everything within me was screaming at me to not do this. It was one of the hardest things I ever had to do. So at the 1 week point, it was a little easier. So I made it 2 ounces. And then in another week, a week and a half, I made it 3, and then 4, and then so on and so forth until I got to 8 ounces of chicken a day. I was still eating the spinach and the celery. And at that point, I found Dr. Sean Baker and Dr. Ken Berry online. And I began binge watching everything that they had out at that point, since it was 6 years ago. And they, of course, were promoting all meat, but the superiority of the nutrients that are in beef. So I wanted to try to switch to beef, and I did it in the only way that I could, which was 96% fat-free ground beef. And I traded the chicken for the beef.
Incidentally, did you go for the fat-free beef and the fat-free chicken because of what you'd been told all those years, that fat was so bad for you?
Yes, yes. In my household, as a youngster growing up, my family, when we did have meat, that was what was purchased. The most lean that you could possibly buy. No skin on the chicken breast, no other part of the chicken, not dark meat, not skin. And when you did steak, it was sirloin or tenderloin. When you did, pork chops, you cut all the fat off of it. When you did, ground beef, you bought the leanest you could possibly buy. Yeah, it was foundational from the time that I grew up. So
yeah. We all grew up in that period where a certain person in America told us everybody that saturated fats were bad, they're going to kill you, and so we all switched. My mother and father switched, and of course that meant I switched. Mm-hmm. And we all grew up knowing that saturated fats are bad for us.
Yes. Yeah. So I successfully was able to switch over to that beef, and at the 3 to 6 month mark, I wanted to switch over to a whole cut of meat because I knew I needed the fat, but I like I said before, I couldn't swallow spoonfuls of tallow or lard or ghee. I couldn't use butter. I couldn't do that. But I couldn't do that yet. So I was putting chuck roasts in the crock pot to get the collagen, to get the fat profile, along with the meat, hoping that I could switch to that and start to rebuild and give my brain the saturated fat that it needed in the only way that I could do it at that point. So that's what I did. At the 6 month mark, I was eating 10 to 12 ounces of the chuck roast. I was learning at that point about oxalates and looking at my previous diet, the overconsumption of just massive quantities of spinach, celery, green beans, certain fruits that are very high, pomegranates, kiwis, very high in oxalates. I wanted to see if any of the physical illnesses that I was experiencing that were told to me to be incurable had any relationship to oxalates. So, we have a way of saying what beef, salt, and water diet is now. We call it the lion diet. But back then, there was no phrase for it. There was no name for it. It was just kind of considered to be the ultimate elimination diet, the most, most strict form elimination diet. For about 20 years, I had been dealing with conditions called interstitial cystitis and vulvodynia and bladder pain. Those 3 conditions felt like shards of glass in my pelvic region. And I went through many treatments and many medications with OBGYN doctors and gynecologists. And they told me that there was nothing they can do, that they're permanent. We don't, there's no cause, there's no cure. You're just going to have to try to mitigate the symptoms and live with this. Well, it turns out that those are all oxalate toxicity issues, just like a kidney stone. It's oxalic acid that's forming crystals for me in my pelvic region and was causing harm, chronic, painful harm. And when I removed the last of the vegetables that I was consuming and ate beef, salt, and water only, within a year, all of my physical issues that were being caused by plant harm were cured, were healed. I have not had those issues for 6 years.
Which is amazing in itself, considering the doctor said there's no chance of ever healing.
Correct.
And you had all of that pain, all of that agony, and it turns out, as we know now, it's because of the food you were eating.
Yeah. So at the 6-month mark, when I removed the vegetables, and then of course that was my journey farther on to understand what component and what harm those overconsumption of plants had done to me. At the 6-month mark, mentally, I was noticing some changes. My brain fog was lifting. My depression wasn't quite as deep. My panic attacks were fewer and far between. My anxiety was calming a little bit. And the cutting and hair pulling sessions were becoming more infrequent. And at this point, I had experienced a quieting of the schizo-affective voices for the first time in my entire life. Nothing had ever quieted them. And they were still screaming at me, but now they felt like they were in another room with the door closed. That was miraculous to me. Even if I never got any better from that 6-month mark, my life at that 6-month mark had so drastically improved that I was already calling it a win, even if I'd never got, any better. But I continued on. So at the 9-month mark, my brain was working enough better that I didn't even have to portion out my meat anymore. I began to finally understand what it felt like to be full and what it felt like to be satiated and to feed my body when my stomach growled. Those were body signals that I had not experienced for many, many decades. When you're starving, literally, your body stops sending the signal. Your body stops growling. That ghrelin signal, that hormonal signal that you're hungry gives up. Your body at a starvation level knows that you're not going to feed it, so why signal it? And I thought about food all the time, thought about cakes, pies, cookies, what I wanted to eat, sugar rushes, binges, but I couldn't allow myself to eat any of it, and felt like if I started eating, I would not be able to stop. And so being full on beef and the healing qualities of salt that your brain needs. Also, I was salt-free for 4 decades.
Which was another thing we were told all the time we were growing up. Salt's bad.
Yeah, salt is bad. Of course, we all know that table salt is still bad. It's not unrefined mineral salt with the minerals that we need in it. But I was I was a poster child for that. No fat, no meat, no salt, no nothing. So the healing qualities of the beef and the salt, I was able to just eat until I was full and then not think about food until the next time I was hungry, which was also a healing for me. I had never experienced that before. You eat a cup full of spinach and that's all you're thinking about is when you're going to eat next. Same with oatmeal, same with rice cakes, same with, it never does anything for you, physically or mentally. So you're constantly thinking about what you're going to eat next. Between the 9-month mark and the 12-month mark, I was now eating over a pound of beef every day with a lot of Redmond's real salt and Baja Gold salt and a lot of water. Within those last 3 months, everything healed completely. The schizo-affective voices were completely gone, never to return. Not a single day, not a single portion of a day, not a single voice or thought since then. Completely 100% gone. I walked away from cutting and hair pulling. This was, I had tried to stop myself for years, because this is an awful, shameful, embarrassing habit. Because when I went out of my home, I had to try to cover this. I had liquid makeup all over my arms and legs to hide the wounds. I had my hair strategically placed to cover bald spots. I had fake eyelashes and makeup on to look like I had eyebrows. It was a tremendous amount of effort to pass as a normal person. So, I knew how bad this was, but it was a neurological condition. I could not stop myself from doing this. I walked away from that and never did it again. I can look at that activity now and say, what in the world was I doing to myself? How broken my brain was. What a descent into madness that I was in bondage to do these types of awful behaviors to myself. And it was something that I couldn't stop. The depression completely left. The anxiety completely left. No more panic attacks. I am thankful that I am filled with overflowing joy every single day. Every single day, I am happy, vibrant, and that is not to say that things don't go wrong in our life. The car breaks down, you get a flat tire, the sewer backs up, there's something goes wrong with your house. I'm not saying that life is unicorns and rainbows. We still have bad days. We still have things going on in our life. But the brain healing that I experienced causes me almost to float above this and know that I just work through the problem and I can handle it, and that's not a problem, because I live in freedom. I live in vibrant health.
Thanks for listening to part 2 of Valerie's story. Part 3 is coming up on a separate podcast. If you have enjoyed this so far, if you have got stuff out of it, then please listen to part 3. It does have a happy ending, and it is inspiration to anybody with chronic illness that you don't have to tolerate what you've got. Also, if you haven't subscribed, please do so. This is a non-profit podcast, and your subscription means a lot to me. So if you haven't already, please subscribe. And finally, if you want to help yourself through what Valerie is talking about, I have a book available on Amazon. It's called See Your Toes Again, the same name as this podcast channel. And that's all about people being able to get onto the ketogenic diet lifestyle. And it's 200 pages, and I talk about all the things that you're going to have to deal with, all the pluses and minuses, all the goods and the bads. So take a look at that. If you like it, then please leave a review as well. I know I'm asking a lot here, but it is a way of other people being able to see what you think and make a decision for themselves. Thank you very much, and I hope you tune in to listen to part 3.